Hi, and welcome to revision of migration with Mr. Mercer. Now, in this video, I'm going to deal with the basics of migration. Then I'll deal with the various question types in two ways. One is to show you the absolute baseline level of knowledge you need, and the second part of each question will be to show you a more in-depth case study approach. Okay, so let's get started with what is migration. Essentially, it's a movement of people between two places. You need to know that it can be voluntary or that it can be forced. There are other types of migration, but the two that you must know are voluntary and forced. You need to know an example of migration within a country and between two countries or internationally. You need to know that there are things called pull and push factors. Pull factors being ones that attract you to a place, push factors being ones that encourage you to leave a place. And finally, that's a note on source and host country. These terms for which country is losing and which country is gaining. Which country is the donor, which country is the receiving country. Okay. Let's get started with voluntary migration. Now, in this video, where you see a table, that is the basic level of notes that you need to have understood. They're fairly self-explanatory, as I'll demonstrate. The push factors for a voluntary migrant, that's one who chooses to leave, would be lack of employment in their place of residence, poor facilities such as services and amenities, social problems, missing friends or family who have already moved, and lower standards of living. The only thing that I can really say here, aside from to learn those, would be learn them, but then also be able to talk about them in greater depth and detail. It's not enough just to say a voluntary migrant moves because of lower standards of living. That's not good enough. You need to be able to say, for example, poorer standards of sanitation and less access to healthcare. Okay, before we get onto the pull factors, it's useful to look at what are the obstacles to migration. It's an unusual question, but there are exam questions that exist asking you, what are the things that hinder somebody moving from A to B? Well, they're very self-explanatory. Language barriers, the physical cost of moving, it's very expensive, transportation costs, etc. The distance between the new and the old home, and leaving your family behind. Anti-immigration policy refers to the laws that the country you're going to might have stopping new people arriving. Okay, pull factors, better working conditions, better services, nicer climate, that can be to do with just general living conditions or better climate for farming, and a fairer government. Now, when you look at these notes, it's important you understand these are the very basic bare bones of voluntary migration. You need to be able to take these basic statements and apply them to a context, a case study that you have learned in detail. I'm going to show you two case studies. The first of which is Britain. 1950s and 60s, there are many UK residents leaving to go to the UK to Australia, Canada, etc. Why did they do this? Well, it was all to do with the end of the war and housing quality being poor, the damage to the housing, a lack of well-paid jobs, and frankly, the poor climatic conditions. Pull factors, promise of new employment, better housing, better weather, and a nice specific case study example. In the instance of Australia, they had the assisted passage scheme, which was a £10 one-way ticket for the whole family and your belongings, to encourage people to move to Australia. The governments of countries such as Australia desperately needed labour, especially skilled labour, and therefore they were encouraging migration. There was no language barrier to stop you, and most of these systems, that means bureaucratic systems, cultural systems, court systems, the country functioned much in the same way as Britain did, and that encouraged people to move. However, nowadays immigration to these countries is much more limited, and many criteria have to be fulfilled before entrants are accepted. For example, you have to have certain skill sets or be of a certain age. Now, that's just one example of voluntary migration. It's likely to be different to the example that you have learned, and you should go with the notes that you've taken in class. Only use this as a guide of how to lay out your voluntary migration examples. Another example, but this time in a different context. You could be asked about the benefits and negatives of migration for the losing country and the gaining country. Now, for me, one of the best examples of migration is between Mexico and the United States of America. Now, I'm not going to talk about the push and the pull factors this time because we've just done that, but I will talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. First of all, for Mexico, the losing country. Well, the advantages are, one, that you get money being sent back from the USA to Mexico. Two, migrants may develop new skills which they can take home. Three, it's mainly younger people who migrate, and because younger people are leaving, that means the birth rate falls. That means there's less strain on healthcare and other services. And if a lot of people are leaving, then it reduces pressure on jobs, which is good for Mexico's government. Disadvantages. Mexico loses people, and they often lose their most skilled people. If it's mainly young males leaving, that can lead to splits within family groups. If it's a rural area, this can often mean that all the young people leave, leaving an elderly population behind who may not be so well equipped to look after themselves. Benefits and negatives for the receiving country, United States, would include filling a labour shortage. Many of these workers are prepared to work in poorer conditions or for less money, or do jobs that US residents don't really want to do. They bring new culture. A good example would be Mexican cuisine and music and traditions to the United States. Many migrants are very highly skilled, and that should never be overlooked. The disadvantages include that there can be pressure put onto jobs. Next point, due to lower wages, migrants are often forced to live in poorer areas with poorer services, and that can lead to ghettoization. Racial tension can develop, often through language barriers and cultural religious differences between the receiving country and the migrants. And money being sent back to Mexico. A nice piece of case study evidence is that the US economy loses $6 billion through money being sent home. Okay, rural-urban migration now. This is internal migration, within the country. We've just dealt with between countries, now we're dealing with within the country. The example I would choose to use here is China. Now, the reason this works quite nicely as an example is because it has plenty of good case study evidence and is also got a nice kind of story-based structure to it. You need to know a little bit of history, but that's quite straightforward. 1949 to 1960, the government introduced a policy called the Great Leap Forward. Basically, this aimed to industrialize China, and it failed drastically. It resulted in a huge famine across the entire country, and that caused many people to try and escape that famine and move to the cities, where food supplies were more regular. As a result, and also during that time, the government encouraged the majority ethnic Han population. That means the ethnic group within the country that was largest, they're called the Han, H-A-N. Now, those people were encouraged to move to all of the outlying districts of China, or areas where there were perhaps people who were not very contented with the government, for example, Tibet, in order to kind of balance the ethnic mix and to provide a sense of kind of security for the government in those areas. So that's another internal migration. First internal migration was because of the failure of the Great Leap Forward. And so because of the famine that caused, people moved to the cities. Second internal migration is when the ethnic Han population were basically required to move around the country to spread their influence to the outlying districts, such as Tibet. Tibet didn't really like that, and they tried to get independence in 1959 to 60. They failed in that effort. That led to lots of refugees spilling over the border into India. But given that we're dealing with internal migration here, it's important that you mention that this led to large numbers of military personnel. Again, ethnic Han military personnel moving to Tibet. And that is another internal migration. Next, during something called the Cultural Revolution, this is 1966 to 69, this was another communist Chinese government initiative to improve the country, in which they targeted urban professionals, anyone they regarded as an intellectual. And these people were regarded as very suspicious by the government, and they were imprisoned, or more commonly, exiled to work in the countryside, where they were, as you can see for yourself, reformed. The Chinese government believed that through hard manual labor you would achieve a kind of higher intellectual state. That was a massive internal migration of people from the urban areas to the rural areas. A nice example of urban-rural migration. Finally, the death of Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China in 1979, led to the end of all of this previous cultural revolution, etc., and period of instability. And the Chinese economy was opened up. These were called market reforms. And this led to a huge rural-urban migration. Two useful case studies here, though there's much more information in your notes, but two case studies would include the SPEZs, that's the special economic zones being set up, such as Beijing and Shanghai, where massive government investment into industry was placed. And this encouraged huge numbers of people to move there, of course. Another good example would be developments such as the Three Gorges Dam, which, because of the area being flooded, displaced, estimates vary, but we're talking the best part of 1 million people were moved by the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. What you see here is a case study answer. You can bind into this all of the push and the pull factors that you know about. But the push and the pull factors won't be enough on their own without the case study. You need to combine the two. So that's not a perfect answer, because it doesn't draw reference to all the basic push and pull factors that you know to talk about from the table you've just seen. However, the table you've just seen would not be enough information without a good quality case study like you see in front of you right now. Lastly, forced migration. We've dealt with voluntary migration between countries, Mexico, USA, or UK, Australia, and we've dealt with voluntary migration within a country. That was China. Now we're looking at forced migration. This is very straightforward, really. You've got the push factors. Overpopulation leads to food shortages. Civil or international wars, of course, makes life dangerous. Food shortages and famines. Religious, racial, or political persecution and prejudice. You have the obstacles to that. Well, the fact that the journey is often dangerous, that transport infrastructure will be damaged, and so that makes the journey difficult. the fear of being a refugee, a stateless citizen, and the fear that border control might return you to your homeland. Pull factors include personal safety, food, water and medicine, better future opportunities. A worked example of this. Here are three. Mozambique to Malawi. Due to flooding, the people in Mozambique had lost their farmland and homes. They couldn't find enough food or water, so they moved to neighbouring Malawi. It's also a poor country, but it offered safety, food, water and medical care. Most of the people eventually returned home. A second example would be late 90s, 1999, split of the former Yugoslavia, in which the war that resulted at that period led to huge migrations of people out of that part of Europe to flee racial persecution and ethnic cleansing. Third example, 1980s. Thousands of people left from Ethiopia due to terrible famines that led to people moving into neighbouring Sudan. And that was due to the soil erosion and drought that was taking place in Ethiopia at the time. A forced migration example, such as this, again, you're going to use these examples. Just to conclude then, you've got various areas of revision to do here. You need to revise voluntary migration between two countries. You need to revise voluntary migration within a country. You need, in order to do that, to revise the push and the pull factors, but also to be comfortable with the case study detail and background of the case of the voluntary migration. After that, you need to know the benefits and the negatives of migration. And after that, you need to know forced migration. A couple of examples of that. So that is voluntary migration, push and pull factors, voluntary migration, benefits and negatives, and forced migration. For each of those examples, you would need case studies to back you up. I would recommend you replay this clip and pause it whenever there's a table and make sure that you know the basic push and pull factors and the obstacles to whichever migration type you're looking at. And then look at the case study examples, but I would always advise you go with whatever notes your teacher's given you, because they will be better than what I can produce for you on one screen of information. Okay, I hope that's been of use, and if you've got any questions about this, come and find me in class.